Good afternoon, everyone, for Pacific Standard and Mountain Standard Time. So there should be like a 1 hour difference. But just to get started, my name is Alberto Tadeo, and I'll be serving as the moderator for the second panel and for today's discussion. Sorry. So first, I just want to begin to introduce the panelists, and then we can get started with like one opening remark, and then we'll just get straight down into it. So right now, I have Dr. Charles Gramlich, sorry, our first panelist, and he holds a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Arkansas and taught for 40 years at Xavier University of Louisiana, the only historically Black Catholic university in the United States. His scholarship has explored the intersection of psychology and literature, with a particular attention to writers such as Robert E. Howard and their works. In addition to his academic publications, he has published numerous stories, poems, and novels under both his own name and various pseudonyms. So, next we have Jim Zub, our second panelist. Jim is the former coordinator of Seneca's College award-winning animation program and has spent more than 20 years working in the comic book industry. He has written over 70 graphic novels and comic series, including works on the Avengers, Dungeons and Dragons, and Samurai Jack. He currently serves as the flagship writer of Conan the Barbarian for Heroic Signatures, making him one of the contemporary creators most directly involved in carrying Robert E. Howard's most famous character into the present day. Next, we have a man of well-renown, Jeffrey Shanks, our third panelist. Again, he did attend the previous first panel, but I'll just give an introductory blurb to just keep everyone ahead and on the same page. Jeffrey is an archaeologist and popular culture historian whose work focuses on Robert E. Howard and other early pulp writers. He previously served as an area chair of pulp studies for the Popular Culture Association and was co-editor of The Unique Legacy of Weird Tales, which was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. Today, he serves as a franchise consultant and advisor for Heroic Signatures and contributes regular essays to the ongoing Conan the Barbarian series published by Titan Comics. So, please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. Nice. I totally love the fact that like I don't get to hear you guys and I just see clapping emojis. Totally. That I'll never get used to that. But thank you for all being here. I'd just like to start with, so it's been nearly like a century after like Robert E. Howard's death, right? And he remains, I would say, an underrated, recognizable figure in genre fiction, since his stories have moved like far beyond pages of pulp magazines and continue to find new audiences through books, his comics, or not his comics, but comics in general, films, games, podcasts, and online communities. So today, my hope for this panel is that we'll be exploring not only Howard's work, but also the ways in which his legacy has evolved through pop culture, adaptation, readership, and world building. So I'd like to begin by thinking about Howard's journey from the pulps to the present day. So my first question is, since that we know that Howard originally wrote for pulp magazines, right? But many readers encounter him today through books, comics, and films, podcasts, and other media that's been popularized. What do you think essentially gets lost, or perhaps maybe even gained, when his stories are removed from their original pulp context and repackaged for later audiences?
Interesting. I can jump in.
Sure,
Some
you can
thoughts on
go
that.
dive right in, Jeff.
I kind of,
You're
because
all
I kind
warmed up.
of, I am a little warmed up, and I kind of touched on this in the first panel a little bit. I was talking about, especially, obviously Conan is his best known character, and so that's, to a lesser degree, Solomon Kane, and Call. But when you talk about Howard's work that's permeated popular culture in a larger way. And it's something I kind of touched on earlier that, in some ways, for better or for worse, Conan has become one of those archetypal type figures, the archetypal barbarian protagonist that has in many ways transcended the original medium in which he first appeared, much like Dracula or Batman or other characters that are, I made the point earlier, like, my son growing up didn't know Batman as a comic book character, which seems crazy to someone of my age, right? But he first encountered him probably on Bruce Timm's Justice League, or the Batman animated series or something like that. He was an animated character. He was a video game character, in Arkham Asylum. And so that's for better or for worse, I think has happened with Conan. Many people come to him, through other media. I came to him, my first introduction was to the, not just the comic book, but when I was about 6 years old, it was back in the, Alberta, you're too young for this, but we had these things called records back in our day. I came to it from the comic book Crawler in the Mists, that had a record that you would put on and play, and it would narrate the comic book, right? Um, Rusty's on here. I know Rusty, tells the story many times that it was, I think it was the Roy Thomas and Barry Windsor Smith's Tower of the Elephant adaptation in
Yeah,
Conan the Barbarian #4, right?
right.
That introduced Rusty, who is the foremost Robert E. Howard scholar, was introduced to the character through a different medium, right? Most of us were. And so I think and then Laura, of course, she made the point, that there's media today, like the video games that, we didn't even think of in the past, right? And so I think it's okay, right? I think it's a good thing, I mean, they're two different worlds in a lot of ways, right? You've got Howard, his original stories, and, those of us that really work with Howard, we're doing that. But, it's okay that his characters have outgrown him, or not outgrown him, transcended him in the original stories in some ways in other media, I think. I think Howard himself, who was a big fan of film and, some of the other media that were just becoming big in his time, I think he would have loved it. I think he absolutely would have loved it. Even the adaptations that maybe aren't that great or whatever. I 100% think he would have loved it.
What I said earlier before we started the recording is, really holds true. It doesn't matter how you got brought to the dance. It just matters that once you get there, you're celebrating with us and that you've
Right.
got an open mind to discovering that material. You were asking specifically what gets lost. I think the reality is most people don't know how old the character is. They don't know that the character is 6 years older than Superman. They don't understand the time when these original stories were produced and the broader kind of cultural implications of who Howard was and the America that he lived in and the Texas that he lived in. They don't necessarily understand the differences in terms of pop culture or, literary culture in that kind of time. They don't understand the kind of life that he lived and the way that those strains worked their way into his stories in subtle or very explicit kind of ways. And one of the things that I feel very passionate about when I'm trying to point people back toward the original source material is both the philosophical and the poetic kind of implications of it. That when you read that prose, it has an incredible innate power to it. And that when you look at the vast majority of material that was being published, in Weird Tales, there's a reason why Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard are the three names that most often come to mind in and around those magazines. Because, no offense to any of the other authors, and many of whom are not, remembered, most of the stuff feels very workmanlike. It feels like it's just sort of hammered out for a check and a quick bit of entertainment, and very little of it seems to last in your mind, whether it's a particular turn of a phrase or the visuals that are summoned up by the words. And so what gets lost if we're not careful is the potency and the power of it. Yes, Jeff's absolutely right that it's grown beyond that means, that medium, and that's an amazing thing. But what the reason why I think the character sticks around is because there is more to it than just big guy
Yeah.
with a sword, cool ancient world mysteries and, hot women, hot men, big action, kicking ass. That those are all qualities of the pulps or qualities of action adventure, sword and sorcery, but Conan's more than the sum of his parts.
I think you've hit on something important there, Jim. The poetry of his language
Hmm.
is lost in some of the adaptations.
Absolutely. And that's one of those things that I didn't fully appreciate until I really kind of I got my second crack at doing the comic series. I wrote some for Marvel, and it was a little bit of a run and gun situation where I was offered the book. I obviously dug in as much as I could, but it was sort of a thing of, okay, I know that there is a poetic quality to it, and I've hit upon it a little bit in my stories, but I didn't fully appreciate the gravity of that until we went to put together the new publishing plan for the Heroic Signatures Titan series that launched in 2023. And I was very thankful I had like 5, 6 months of just development material where I was building with my editor at the time, Matt Murray, and with Jeff and with other people, Fred Malmberg and people at the company. And so going back and rereading, reading for research is so different from reading for entertainment, and having a notepad by my side and writing down turns of a phrase or vocabulary, not because I wanted to copy it word for word, but I just wanted to like marinate myself in it and try and think a little bit more lyrically or get some of that cadence into my own narration. And obviously, I'm doing it with an eye to respect the master and where this stuff all came from, but I'm still trying to be my own writer. I never want to just cut and paste and go, yep, well, that's what Bob put in it. I'm not doing adaptations. That's the other thing. Very little of the work that I'm doing is a direct adaptation of a Howard story. I'm sort of fitting between these larger pillars and trying to tell other stories to excite and surprise readers, which is, audacious, but I think is really valuable so that people month to month don't know what the next plot point's going to be. They can't all see the climax coming because they've read it and seen it adapted many times before.
I'll
Charles,
throw in throw in my own thoughts, I guess. I was introduced to Howard through in the tradition of. So I'm reading books by Lynn Carter, John Jakes, Gardner Fox, and they all had in prominent letters, sometimes bigger than the author's name, in the tradition of Conan. Very seldom did it have in the tradition of Robert E. Howard, but
Mhm.
occasionally you see that. But in the tradition of Conan, so that was I'm like, well, who is this guy? Because my library didn't have any Howard books; they had the other stuff. Um, when we come to the loss, I think one of the things that's lost, um, it's kind of a loss and a gain in a strange way, is that that illustrated the already process of the diluting of Howard's unique vision. Uh, the poetic prose is certainly there, but as we talked about, as somebody talked about in the first panel, Howard was in everything that he wrote, whether it's the westerns, the humorous westerns, the serious westerns, the horror stuff, the fantasy stuff, and that personality, that tremendous personality that's behind all that, has gotten diluted through the spread of all this sort of material. It's inevitable. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I think this whole Zoom conference is an aspect of, well, we need to come back, and some of us at least need to come back and get back to that core Howard, and a lot of people have, but that core Howard characteristics and Howard personalities. Um, the gain has been that a lot more people have come to the story, and a lot of them don't care whether Howard, who wrote it, but some of them will find their way to Howard. I had saw so much of this in the tradition of that I began looking around. I think the first Howard stuff that I found, I went into a barn, I went into a Borders or Barnes and Noble, I guess, at the mall. It wasn't Barnes and Noble at that time. I don't remember what, but they used to have these bookstores in the mall, and I found some Robert E. Howard stuff, and I told my mom I needed to get these. I was probably about 15, and she goes, "Well, you can have two." And I spent 20 minutes trying to figure out which of the two I was going to bring home. So,
I think what's amazing is, with each iteration, any kind of pop culture character, whenever you discover the character, that iteration obviously has a big role to play in how you envision them. So if you saw those Frazetta covers, the Lancer or the Ace paperbacks, then that sort of galvanized in your mind. If you saw the Arnold movie, if you read the, Barry Windsor Smith and the John Buscema illustrated comics. Like whatever kind of version brought you in is obviously going to have a warm glow. And I know that that has a big role to play. And you're mentioning about the video game stuff now, games like Age of Conan or Conan Exiles, that is a vision of a Hyborian age that hopefully leads people back to the source material, but it also colors obviously their expectations for it. And that's the kind of balancing act that you're trying to work with. You're trying to sort of wrestle with the broader pop culture icon while trying to imbue it with as many of those qualities that are important to you from the source material. At least that's the way it works for me, anyways.
That's so interesting because you've all kind of touched on a little bit like at different aspects of Howard's media afterlife and the way
Hmm.
it persists and survives, right? So my question with like the way you've all lightly talked about like his poetic prose and his lines and the way that like it's diluted. So different people and different modern audiences today could maybe stumble upon Howard like a road, but all roads lead back to Robert E. Howard. And so my question then is, um, why Robert E. Howard, right? Like, why not other pulp authors or other writers? Like, what makes him so easily like maybe adaptable or worth
Yeah.
changing or worth like, you know,
And I touched upon this a little bit before. I think it is the fact that the quality of the prose is a lot stronger, the poetic and the lyrical quality, because they're pulp stories and most of them can be read in one sitting. Like the vast majority of them are, 10,000 words or less in some cases. I think like Frost Giant's Daughter is like 7,000 words or something. And it hits so that it is simultaneously entertaining and engaging and lyrical, and it summons these powerful, powerful moods in your mind. The characters feel really rich. There's enough description there that you can kind of get your mind around them, but it doesn't pin you down. It doesn't get so, excuse me, like up its own ass in terms of tight little descriptions and overly, prosaic. It hits like a thunderclap and then it moves. It moves with energy, it moves with action. Even the ways that he describes violence and these fight scenes, there is a lyrical sense, but it never is so purple that you feel like you can't understand it or you're unraveling it. Your mind is moving at the clip that he wants you to feel that action and wants you to sort of be a part of it. And I think that that's something that a lot of other writers at the time, whether it was more instinctive for him than with other people, it's just really, really potent stuff. And the after effect, the aftershock of that was so good and genre defining that it has become, for lack of a better term, infinitely adaptable. That the visions and the iconic elements of it and in some ways the tropes that it generates are still rippling outwards.
I would add to that too. At least this was my experience reading when I was reading the stories when I was younger, is how visual and cinematic as
Hmm.
well his scenery is. In addition to we talked about the poetic prose, but
Yeah.
100% it's there. And even as a kid, when I'm reading the Aces and you go from a DeCamp or Carter story to a Howard story, even as a 10-year-old, I could like, oh, this is different. Oh, this is very different.
Why did this
Right.
just slow down so much? Yeah,
Right. But it was
yeah.
his, I was always just had that vision in my mind's eye when he's describing a scene, when he's describing a setting. It
Mm.
was so real, so visceral, and so visual. And at least that was my experience. And I think that that may be also one of the reasons why I feel like it's so easily translatable, to other media. And that said, it's very rare that I feel like that vision that I have in my head that anything even gets close to it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're there, right? But it's just not. I don't know. It's tough, but so many people have tried, so many people have their own visions in their head of what they're seeing. And so many creators, have tried to get that vision on the page or on the screen, or whatever the medium is. But I think that's part of it too. I think it's the visual way in which he writes, where you can really see that, the colors and the textures and even smell the smells, right?
In
When
your
he's
mind's eye,
in
for
your
sure.
mind's
Yeah.
eye, right? That
Yeah.
and Howard did that in ways that many other writers I don't think could do.
In a
Play off
sense, he
that.
made you a co-creator of the story.
Yes. Yeah.
To play off that, I was going to say that, like I said, I started with Gardner Fox and John Jakes, and I enjoyed those. Um, I could imagine the scenes and stuff like that. But when I started reading Howard, I started to dream it. I mean, literally, I started to have dreams that were sword and sorcery stories, sword and sorcery ideas, sword and sorcery imagery, and not necessarily what Howard described or meant, but it was like the whole concept of the archetype, that it's evoking these things that are in my mind, um, that were really coming through. And I started having multiple dreams related to Howard type stuff. And it didn't occur before that, did not happen before that.
I think one of the things I love as well about the stories is there is the visceral experience that's happening around the character, around all of his characters, whether that's true of Conan or Solomon Kane or Cull or any of them, frankly. Uh, but then there's always this outer kind of mystery that's happening. There's enough in the shadows, there's enough that's not explicitly explained that you need to also kind of infer, or it gets you thinking about other questions. How did this get here? What does this mean? How do these things relate together? And, the more research that I do, thanks to, people like Jeff or my current editor, Chris Butera, pointing me towards different stories and the way that we're trying to build our, for lack of a better term, Howard verse that we're having in the comic series, where we're tying in different bits from different Howard stories, some of the repetition in terms of names and symbols and concepts, some of them as express crossovers with things like Kings of the Night, but other times just little nuanced repetitions that could have been done honestly for expedience sake, but then now in the rearview mirror, we can look and go, but what if it was part of a grand tapestry? What if it was all related and tied together, and we can elevate it and sort of celebrate it at the same time?
There's a concept that I think about sometimes. I call it resonance. And
Hmm.
resonance is that you don't know the meaning of this thing. You don't know even the meaning of the word, but it connects to something, other experiences that you've had, other things that you've read, and you just feel it feels a little bit familiar, but still mysterious. And Howard had that quality. There's a lot of resonance in his stuff, and
Absolutely.
a lot of the Clonans or pastiches did not have that. Did not have that. Now some of them did. I mean, some of them had good quality. John Maddox Roberts had some really good stuff.
Mhm.
Carl
Well,
Wagner.
they're always focusing on a surface level of violence, or the lone hero or things like that, and they seem, in my experience, whenever I read one of those stories, it feels like it misses the philosophical, it misses the existential, and it misses the poetic. And without that, you've just got this weird veneer of Conan instead of the real deal.
That's really lovely that you've all touched on the significant like resonance it's had with like audiences old and new. And we've talked about like the relevancy of his like the cultural phenomenon that Robert E. Howard has. So I wanted to do a little pivot, make it a little bit more personable, and just ask, was there a significant character or story that has like really resonated with you and kept with you this entire time? Or has that particularly changed? Essentially, what is the one Robert E. Howard work that's kind of like impressed upon you?
Charles, why don't you go first?
I think it wasn't the first Howard story I read, but the one that's maybe had the biggest impact and has appeared in my dreams is Valley of the Worm.
Mm.
Oh man,
James Allison's story. There was only two
so
James Allison
good.
stories published during Howard's lifetime, and they were both very similar. Garden of Fear was the other one, and it was actually kind of a similar story with a different creature. But Valley of the Worm, which I think probably he is a jumping off from like Siegfried and the Dragon kind of tale. This whole idea of the wandering tribal kind of thing, which I know humans were. we were nomadic, you know. That just stayed with me forever, and so I've really enjoyed all the James. March's Valhalla is another James Allison story that's
Hmm.
really good. So I'd have to say, I mean, I like Solomon Kane and Bran; those are great characters, and Conan. But the James Allison stuff has really engaged my imagination over a long period of time.
It's funny you mentioned James Allison because the first chance I got to cross over characters from the Howard stories was at Marvel, and they asked me if I would, the Conan series was running, and they wanted to bring other Robert E. Howard characters into the mix. And so I put together, at the time, it was going to be called Kingdom of the Worm, and then they changed the name of it to a more whatever sexy comic selling title, which they called Serpent War. And the Valley of the Worm is actually the core story, the connective tissue that James Allison and his, multiple lives that he's living and dreaming about became the connective tissue for us to connect these characters together. And I was really happy with that. And the minute that I put that into the proposal, because they didn't tell me which characters I had to use except for Conan, they wanted to have Solomon Kane and Agnes de Castellan. And I added that character as sort of the fulcrum for this entire thing. And Fred Malmberg, who was the president of Heroic Signatures, the minute I put that in there, he's like, "Oh, I like this guy. He cares about the material. He really knows this kind of stuff." And so it's funny that that isn't the story that I was going to say, but the fact you brought that up is, intrinsic and powerful for you. It late in my, kind of coming to the original stories, it has a very special place kind of for me because of that, obviously. Jeff, how about you?
So I'm gonna give two answers. The first one, I'm gonna start with a Conan story because that was my introduction to the character when I was reading those when I was younger, and it was a long time before I got to the other ones. And out of all the Conan stories, the one that really struck me when I read it was Beyond the Black River, which, is probably not a surprise. That's usually in everybody's top three, Conan stories, if not top three Howard stories. But specifically, I was talking about the visual aspects of it. There was something about that story that I didn't realize it at the time now, right? But looking back, it's very much a Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness vibe to this story. I probably hadn't seen Apocalypse Now yet, but it's like, don't leave the canoe, right? Because there, Howard was making the setting itself, the Pictish wilderness, an antagonist, a character, right? In a way that it felt viscerally terrifying that just the slightest sound in that forest could be you could be dead the next second and not know it with a pick smashing your brains, right? And reading that story as a kid, that was so damn powerful. But I'm gonna flash forward to now, having read most of Howard's fiction and delved into it. There is one story that, above all others, resonates with me on an incredibly deeper level, and I truly think it's Howard's best work, and that's Worms of the Earth. It is often have done the intellectual exercise. If there's any, let's say Norton was crazy and decided to do an anthology of pulp fiction or something like that, and you could choose one Howard story to go in it. One story. It wouldn't be a Conan story. It would be Worms of the Earth. Not only do I think is it one of his most powerful, best written stories with some incredibly memorable scenes in there, multiple memorable scenes, right? The crucifixion, but it encompasses so many of his themes that are important to him. It is a sword and sorcery tale, of sorts. It is a historical novel. It focuses on that theme of civilization versus barbarism, the Picts versus the Romans. It incorporates Lovecraftian horror elements and Gothic horror elements all together in one. It includes a lot of his evolutionary anxiety that is in a lot of his fiction. That goes back to even Darwinian themes that were popular in popular fiction, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So much of Howard is in that story. Not only is it just brilliantly written and powerful, it encompasses so much of what he is all about and his philosophy and his ideology that he was trying to incorporate into his work. And I don't think any other story does it as well and as magnificently as Worms of the Earth.
Man, oh man, you guys are picking some amazing stuff here. I feel like I'm Now I should have gone first, then I wouldn't have had this
Ah.
problem. But that's all good. The first one I recall reading in the Lancers was, Rogues in the House. And so
Mm.
it's funny because as a story now, it's probably not even one of my favorites, but it was visceral at the time because of that, the creepiness of them sneaking around the manor trying to avoid Thack, and that it was trying to pretend to be a man, like it was wearing the robes and it wanted to be was a red priest or whatever. And that creepiness that it couldn't understand and it was going to lash out, that really stuck with me. Obviously, that Frazetta painting that's on the cover just absolutely grabbed my attention and kind of blew my mind. And then, of course, you get Tower of the Elephant, which to me, and as a kid, Dungeons and Dragons was my way into sword and sorcery. It was also my way into storytelling. I know exactly how old I was. I was 8 years old because the red box, the basic set of D&D, was 9 and up, and my older brother was like, technically you shouldn't even be playing this, which is what older brothers do. And eh, that when I read Tower of the Elephant, it is such a prototypical, D&D adventure before there was a thing as D&D. And there's a reason why, Gary Gygax has Conan as a core influence for the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. It's got your classic kind of structure. It's a caper. They're going into, a fortress, a tower. There's multiple action encounters. There's puzzles. There's riddles, and there's even, dramatic role play. The pathos, that is at the heart of the climax of Tower of the Elephant isn't about it's not about the wizard. It's almost like fait accompli. By the time we finish the sacrifice, uh, you know, of Yagkosha, the story's already over. We've already hit the high of where it's going to go. Now it's just sort of seeing the tragic sort of spiral and the vengeance that is executed upon it, and the way it's written and the depth and the lyricism of it really grabbed me, at the time. And it still does. Like one of the things that's surreal for me about working on new Conan stories is my ability to go back and reread those stories and just build momentum. Not because I want to tell those exact same stories, but I just want to have even an iota of the impact that they may have on a new reader. And sometimes in unexpected ways. So a story like God in the Bowl, it's one of the stranger paced, Howard stories. It's a strangely paced Conan story. There's very little action, especially there's almost none in the first half, essentially. But what I love about it is the simmering time bomb that the Sumerians going to go off on these guards that are um, consider him a murderer, and the investigator and everyone else. And we don't know when it's going to happen, but we know it is going to happen. And then it's like you're reading those paragraphs, and the moment you seem to settle in and go, oh, it's not coming anytime soon, he erupts on them. And I absolutely love that scene where he just goes off. And all of a sudden, it was so obvious in retrospect, but it still catches me off guard. And the breathtaking amount of violence that is unleashed in that instant in about 3 paragraphs is jaw dropping. And then it goes back and it quiets back down again. And that contrast and his ability to pull that trigger on that action blew my mind. And it was funny, I was talking to Jeff about this. My first solo written Conan story is one called The Gambler that I did for Marvel's Savage Sword. And I told him that it's built on the bones of God in the Bowl. And he's like, I don't see that at all. And I'm like, now, I put Conan in this gambling hall where he's surrounded by all these guards and he can't just attack people. He's sort of on his back foot right from the get-go. We know there's going to be incredible violence. We know he's going to get revenge. We just don't know when. And it's very much the same kind of thing. I've got a bomb lit. You don't know how long the fuse is. And then once it goes off, everything just rolls and rolls and rolls. And so sometimes you take inspiration from the thing without it necessarily being a beat for beat.
All,
And
all
then
of these stories that we mentioned here, Valley of the Worm, the Tower of the Elephant,
Mhm.
Worms of the Earth. I'm like dewy-eyed at the end, toward the end of these things, because I'm feeling the emotions. I mean,
100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tower of the Elephant. I think I was probably crying by the time I got
Yeah,
to
Yeah.
the pathos is unreal. That's what's so cool about it. It's not, so many people's pop culture vision of Conan is he's like this invulnerable killing machine. And you're like, yes, there's incredible explosive violence and Pulp, action and but the most powerful moments are like pathos, they're like stoicism, they're like intensity of emotion, they're tragedies, they're like Mirrors of Tuzen Thun is about
Mhm.
the choices unmade in your life and where destiny may take you if you'd have done something different, and all the different iterations of yourself stretching off into infinity. Like, that is not your typical sword and sorcery. This is not kill a monster, get the girl kind of stuff. Like, that's what's
Yeah.
so cool about it. That's what makes it so memorable.
Tower is my go-to story to recommend to new people.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just for
It's
some of
the
the obvious,
on
because
ramp.
it's good, because it's
Yeah.
quick, because it's gives you that the vibe and all that, because it also undermines those expectations that people might have. Oh, it's a Conan story, like Arnold, you mean?
Yeah.
Here, read this. You
Well, and
know,
that's the thing. I feel like my job, I'm trying to pull together all these strings. If you love the Arnold movie, you will see enough of that, best parts of that character, the physicality and the intensity and it's like I want the Basil Polidorus soundtrack on the page. Like, I want that, the coolness of that movie, if that gets you in the door, or the video game, you love the way that that plays, or the vision of that world. But then I want you to feel something more. I want you to get a little more of the pathos and the intensity, more of the philosophy, which sounds really odd to a lot of people when
right,
you talk to them about Conan the Barbarian. They just think of like stab, stab, get the
right.
treasure,
Here, try
pumping the
Conan the
iron.
Cimmerian instead.
Right. And that's the thing for me is if I
Right,
can, the visuals of our comics are trying to bring the best of the Bronze Age comics and a little bit of, the Frizettan kind of feel to it if we can muster it. But if we can get you to stick around and feel something, if I can get you to realize that this character is shockingly thoughtful and philosophical about existence in and around that violence and survival, then,
yeah.
hopefully I've done my job.
And if they make it as far as the back matter, I will give them the actual stories to go
And that was the thing for me,
to
right? Getting Jeff in there on
right,
that first story arc, our first four issues. Jeff wrote these amazing essays in our free comic book day issue that launched the series in 2023. And he was only contracted for those five, for the zero issue and then 1 to 4. And I essentially just crowbarred him in there on 5 and beyond because I felt like it brought more value to the cover price, and if you read everything cover to cover and you feel like you've got more out of it, then that's going to be a value add proposition. But also that it gave us all more heft. It gives everything that we do more literary and historical heft. If people realize I'm not just randomly throwing things on the page.
right.
I'm not just like, yeah, man, okay, so Conan fights a monster and he's going to go somewhere you've never seen before. Like, that I'm thinking about the source material or the broader implications of where it comes from, then it elevates hopefully everything in and around it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I mean, and it's that's what I'm trying to do, and it kind of goes, Alberta, to kind of what your question was, like, are things lost, and when things in translation to other media, and that is what I'm trying to do with my essays, is situate what Jim does and what he's writing,
Mhm.
situated in that Howardian context, right? He's not just pulling this out of his ass, as you say, right?
Right.
It's coming out of the context of the original stories. Did you like that? You thought that was cool? Here,
Yeah.
here's what Jim was reading. This is where it was coming from. This is where that idea, this is what Howard was doing with it. Go back and read these original stories if you like that. And if a handful of people do, cool, I've done my job, right? I know that most people probably won't, and that's okay. But some will,
But the great thing is the
you know?
material is always there.
It's
So if
always
someone
there,
reads the
right?
comic, they reread it, they read the trade paperback, whatever. And at first, it was like when I was a kid, I didn't read the letters pages. You were just like,
Right,
yeah, whatever. I want to know
right.
what my favorite heroes are doing. And then at some point you marinate a little more in it and you go, oh man, look at the fandom, look at the discussions and the rippling effect of this month after month. And you start to appreciate those things. And in this way, I feel like whenever someone comes back to it, if they didn't read it the first time through, they missed out, but that it's always there waiting for them.
Yes, I am 100 on the chat. I am 100% an imitation, a poor man's Fred Blosser. 100%. That's what absolutely what I'm going for. If I can do what Fred did back in the day in Savage Sword, even in a small, tiny way, then I've done my job.
That's great that you've all mentioned like how you've dreamt or you've worked on comics, as well as like touching upon the different things that you love and like to keep with you about Robert E. Howard. And I'm just
Mhm.
wondering if we could go into more like the specific world building aspects that like because you've all mentioned how like the world just sucks you in like one line and I'm all,
Sure.
but also it's easy enough for me to also just like step back and then go into another work of his and then also get sucked into that world. So is there anything that particularly like distinguishes Howard's world building to like other forms of world building that you want to like maybe highlight or emphasize?
Well,
Charles, dive in because Jeff and I are going to run
Y-
ramshot all over this
Yeah,
thing.
like this, this is Charles, go for it, man.
I mean, it was the first Howard, the Hyborian Age was the first, and maybe other authors had done this sort of stuff for themselves, but the Hyborian Age was published, and I was able to read this, and I'm like, oh, you can have this consistency within this world building thing. You can have these kind of connections. You can have the resonance, which is to suggest these connections and stuff like that. A lot of the names that Howard used, Stygia and so on, they're resonant with modern places or more modern places and things like that. And so I immediately began, because I was already sort of making up stories in my head. I immediately began doing the same kind of thing. I started a little notebook and I called it, the encyclopedia of this world that I did it the same way. I wrote a little timeline kind of thing. This happened and that happened, and then I kept, here's characteristics of the character. So it was a revelation for me that I was doing it kind of in my head, but it was a revelation for me that you needed to put this down. And once you had it down, you had this consistent environment in which you could set stories. And that triggered a lot of other stories as well, because I'm writing stuff down and thinking, oh, I could tell a story about that. I can't do it right now because I'm doing something else, but I'll make a note that I can go to this at another point. So it was amazing to me. Yeah.
And
You
I
know that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, sorry. Go ahead if you
So the thing is about the Hyborian Age that amazes me is there's strains of historical bits in there, but he's also given himself a playground to kind of express so many different types of stories, Bronze Age or Middle Ages or, Renaissance, even kind of stuff like that. The Hyborian Age is this smattering of all these different influences, and he can just deposit the character. The fact that the stories are out of order and they're being told in this kind of tall tales almost format of, the very first story is Phoenix on the Sword. He's already the king. So we know he survives long enough to become the king of Aquilonia by his own hand, and yet we're completely compelled by each new iteration and chapter and reflection forward or backward, but that the place feels visualized exactly like what Charles was saying. It feels consistent to itself, and yet there's so much left unsaid that it feels infinitely explorable, that there are shadows always to be uncovered, and that even if Conan himself goes to a place, he will never fully comprehend its meaning. The machinations of gods and demons and greater powers are doing things beyond his capacity to understand. But the act of him arriving there, he's the fly in the ointment of these grand plans. He will undo them, whether or not he has any idea what he has undone. That the very act of survival and exploration is creates change in the world and breaks on his willpower, even if he has no idea why that thing was there in the first place. So there's an implied history. Sometimes it's told to us, sometimes it's expressed in really little echoes and bits and pieces or consistency from story to story. And then there's vast areas unspoken that just feel so exciting just out of reach. That's one of the things that I find so interesting about it. And in some ways, more interesting than the kind of world building where you put the spotlight on every single square inch and you define everything in absolute terms, that is an exercise in bookkeeping rather than in sort of dramatic storytelling.
So Howard's world building is, for those of you that read any of my, nonfiction work on this, is kind of the focus of most of my academic and scholarship on Howard, as looking at Howard as a world builder and trying to understand his mechanism for world building. Um, Rusty, I think, coined the term anthropological world building. And so as I started getting into this and building on the work that he and Patrice and others were doing, that they had started touching on, that was kind of the angle that I went with because of my own background in archaeology and anthropology, because I was also seeing what Howard was doing here that a lot of people didn't catch. And you see it in the Hyborian Age essay, and you really see it as you start to delve into his work and even some of his earlier works. A lot of people don't realize there is a prototype for the Hyborian essay that he put into the much earlier story, Men of the Shadows, written in 1926, the beginning of his career. He was already doing that, sort of a fantastic fictional nonfiction essay of a sort, right? Where he is telling the stories of what he called the races of man, the Lemurians, the Atlanteans, the Celts, and his favorite, the Picts, right? And what you start to realize, this is why it's anthropological world building. Anthropology in the late 19th, early century was all about, stuff that's outdated now, right? But they would categorize humans in different groups and trace them through time. That's what Howard was doing with his world building. All of his stories, when you look at the stories from going back all the way to the Thurian Age, through the Hyborian Age, into modern times, what he's doing is tracing the history of these different groups of people through time. He's following the story of the Picts through time as they evolve and devolve, and the Lemurians and the Atlanteans and the Celts, right? He's telling you the stories of these different peoples and how they interact with each other, and they fight and they interbreed and they move around and they do all these things. I didn't use the other word that I normally use because I don't, whatever, we're on YouTube here. But that was how he built his world. He built it using these different groups of humanity, fantastic races, quote, races that he would tell the stories of. That was his foundation. That was his matrix for building his world. Much like, Tolkien is a philological world builder. He created languages, and then like Elvish and Dwarvish and things like that, and he built his world on top of languages. Howard built his world on top of these groups of people that he was telling the story of over the millennia. That was the backbone of his world building. And it was much more intricate and much more sophisticated and much more complex than he's ever given credit for. I remember, DeCamp would make comments about how, oh, Howard's worlds are just thrown together. He's just taking historical analogs and mashing them together. Yeah, he was doing that. But there is so much more underneath that. That's just the superficial layering, the paint on the surface of the statue, right? That's beneath that. DeCamp was never able to see beneath that. There is so much more there. He was trying to tell a great story of humanity in its different facets and its different aspects over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and building his different series and different groups of stories on top of that and interlinking them all together. It was a magnificent work of world building that he just really doesn't get enough credit for. And this is a large part of what my work is trying to demonstrate that, trying to show that, just how sophisticated it was. We use the term Howard verse. It's kind of a cutesy term for all of this, but that was what he was doing. He was building this great universe, telling the stories of people throughout time in the way that old 19th century historians like to do these macro histories, right? That's kind of fallen out of favor these days, right? But that's what Howard was trying to do in a fictional way and build these incredible worlds on top of that. So
Howard
that's
loved history. I
Howard's
mean, we
world
know
building.
Howard loved history.
Loved history. He loved history, and this gave him the ability to do that, to take real history and then turn it into something that was part of his own imagination, part of his own expression of his own creativity. In a way that honestly, I don't think anyone has ever done it this way before. And think about this too, right? He's working in a time where fantastic world building wasn't really a thing yet,
Right.
Tolkien was doing it some over on his own, but nobody knew about it yet. The Hobbit wasn't published until 1937. Howard was building fantasy maps. Just think about fantasy maps, right? You don't have a fantasy book now
Right.
without a map in the front of the book,
Yeah,
right?
there's such a staple of the genre
Such
now,
a staple. But he
Yeah.
was doing that in 1932 before anybody else had any kind of fan. There were very few fantasy maps out there, like only a handful. It actually like, hey, let's actually map this out, right? A lot of the things that we take for granted now in world building, Howard was a pioneer of,
And that's the
so
thing with any kind of trailblazing or icon, right? So when people look at some of those stories and they go, "Oh, it's so tropey," you're like, "Yeah, it made the tropes." That's the thing you don't understand. You look and you go, "Oh man, I knew." Yeah, I've seen these kinds of things before, and you're like, "Yep, they all built on the foundation of this thing." Conan is arguably the most famous fantasy character in the world. And I say that because, your average person on the street, if I say the word barbarian, they would know Conan or they would say Arnold or whatever else, right? Like it has that kind of pull across the world. My mother knows that the hobbits are little people, but she couldn't tell you the individual names of them. But she
right,
knows Conan. She knows who Conan is even before
right.
I ever worked on the character. Like that's the thing. It carries a different kind of a reputation along with it. It is at the absolute bedrock of this thing.
Conan and Tarzan, probably those two, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, they're two of the ones that have really managed to hold on through the pulps better than practically any other character. But it's because of the iconic nature of their origin and those traits that feel like anytime someone works on a barbaric style character, they are either specifically leaning into or leaning out of the tropes that make Conan who he is. So, if you're painting outside the lines, it's because the lines are there.
Well, I mean, that was part of Moorcock's comments about Elric that
Yeah,
essentially kind of the anti-Conan. He didn't want to do the
Right.
Conan tropes,
exactly.
create his own, but he was very clear in going 180 degrees away from these
You've
things.
got it. Exactly. In order to design
Yes.
the character that's the antithesis, you're saying something about the original. You're saying something about
Yeah.
the icon.
It's one of
Absolutely.
the brilliant things about the Elric series. That really was one of the first true deconstructions of
Yeah.
not just Howard, but Tolkien as well, right? This goes back
Mhm.
to what Laura was saying of Howard and Tolkien is kind of the pioneers, the two different pioneers of the two different branches of fantasy fiction. People did know this 50 years ago, right? They've just forgotten. And that's what he was doing with that, not just creating a character, a protagonist that in every way is the opposite of Conan, right? Physically
Mhm.
weak, dependent on a sword, a vampiric sword for injury, all of those kinds of things. But even the Meldemoneans themselves, that's a deconstruction of Tolkien's elves, right? What if you
Mhm.
did have elves that live for thousands of years? They wouldn't be these happy, mystical beings. No, they would be like Cenobites from Hellraiser, you know? And, it's brilliant
Absolutely.
stuff, right? Yeah, we got off the track there, but it was good
No,
stuff.
Shockingly, we went on tangents.
really good.
Who'd have ever imagined?
And as you've all
Comes
touched
back
upon, like,
around. You could, it's like, well, just another tangent, but it's say about Jimi Hendrix. He might not have been the most perfect guitarist, but if he made a mistake, he would bend it. Bend that riff until it made some sense somewhere. And
Right?
how
Right. Incorporated into the whole.
but yes, we've touched about him loving history. And as someone who's just started reading Conan and getting to the Howard verse, as Jeff coins it, I guess,
Mhm.
um, my question is there anything in particular about his writing style of how he engages with like history that like you can kind of see in contemporary culture that kind of like has outlasted him or
Interesting.
importance of that? Or is there any importance of that?
You're talking specifically about the historical aspects of his writing?
Oh. And how he engages as an author and as a writer.
I mean, it's fascinating to me because, he isn't obviously he never got the chance to travel to so many of the places that he wanted to see, but he was well read enough and had such visceral imagination that he's able to paint, these pictures of these places and these times that he uses such intense vocabulary about specific armor and weaponry, and he's layering those into to the point where I would have to go search for what those things were and understand how they kind of fit together, even when they were incongruent in something like the Hyborian Age, where there's different levels of medieval weaponry or different eras kind of clashing together.
This is a tough one. Um, in general, Howard did love history, archaeology, anthropology. He was reading many popular works on these subjects, and we see that in his fiction. How relevant is that to today is kind of a challenging question. Part of the problem is a lot of the works that he was reading are very much now discredited, in a number of ways, right? But I want to throw one thing out there that I do think it's still probably dated now, but he was ahead of his time on when it comes to understanding histories and cultures and those sorts of things. And that's the idea of cultural evolution. And this is something that is very much in his work. And we hear it in famous lines from like Beyond the Black River, for example, barbarism is a natural state of mankind and all of that, and the whole barbarism versus civilization thing. It he's using language when he talks about savages, barbarians, civilization. Those words all have kind of jumbled together and lost their meaning today. In the sense that they had them in Howard's time, those were terms that had very specific meanings in late 19th century anthropology. The term savage was used for cultures that we would today call hunter-gatherer cultures, right? A non-technological, not agricultural, no metallurgy, Stone Age cultures, for lack of a better term, right? Barbarians were the next stage in evolution, right? Where you have the beginnings of agriculture, the beginnings of metallurgy, those sorts of things. And then civilization is when you get writing and the arts and a more complex political system, those kinds of things. And there was this idea, this was coming out of Darwin's theory of evolution becoming popular in biology. People were looking to apply that concept everywhere. And there were people trying to apply that to cultures as well. Cultures evolve over time from simple to complex, from savages to barbarians to civilized in a very neat linear order, right? And this is what Lovecraft was talking about in his arguments with Howard. This is a good thing. We're progressing. It's progress, right? Civilizations progress and become more civilized over time. This is a good thing. And what Howard was saying is that doesn't really make sense. Not if you actually look at history. That isn't what cultures do, right? Sometimes they rise, sometimes they fall. Barbarians overthrow the civilization and they become civilized themselves. And it's much more complex. And that's what he was trying to say. He was challenging this very much outdated model of cultural evolution that was popular in the 19th century that we know today is pretty much nonsense, right? Um, Howard was already starting to challenge that idea. Like, that doesn't make sense. That isn't what actually happens when you look at history. And that was a large part of what that argument was with Lovecraft, right? He wasn't saying it's good to be a barbarian. What he was saying is that barbarism seems to be that sort of state of equilibrium between the two extremes of, quote, savagery and, quote, civilization, right? Whatever those terms mean. And that civilization cultures are fluctuating up and down that ladder all the time. Now, that's still too simplistic. That's not really, today that doesn't, in modern anthropology, we don't think of terms that way. We don't even use the term civilization anymore because that's so loaded, right? But Howard was at least already in his time challenging that prevailing idea, saying this doesn't make sense. Humans are much more complex than that. History is much more complex than that. Cultures are much more complex than that. So I think in that sense, too, he was very much ahead of his time, still dated by modern standards, but very much ahead of his time for the 1920s and 30s when he was writing. And he puts that in his fiction. He puts that in his stories. You get it in there. That was a large part of his ideology. There was challenging those ideas that he didn't know were outdated, at the time he was writing, or obsolete. And I think that's one of the things that I think is very impressive with Howard. He was certainly at least ahead of his time. He may not have been ahead of the 21st century, but he was ahead of the early 20th century.
I think Jeff said mostly kind of the same thing I was thinking. The thing that resonates from the past is that every civilization, every culture rises, it falls, it leaves remnants of itself, though. And those remnants, a lot of things in Howard's stories are about remnants of earlier ages and earlier times, the Atlanteans, the Aleutians, and all this kind of stuff. So um, that's a lesson for today is that, we think whatever culture that we're in is going to be this way forever and is going to survive, and it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for your inputs on that tangent that I just wanted to go and
No,
touch
no
on.
worries.
That's a good one.
It's like again, I know that someone has mentioned that like the questions are not as informed. I am a new into this Howard verse. I just to clarify. But
It's
to
all good.
continue that, I loved how you all mentioned that like Conan specifically as well is more than just this flattened out barbarian character, and that Howard's writing is actually way more nuanced and layered in terms of
Mhm.
world building and the interactions between groups and races and the cultures of these different groups. And I was wondering, is that one of the only like major misconceptions that have kind of been prevalent amongst like contemporary pop culture? Or are there any other big misconceptions or something that we're missing if we're trying to get into Howard?
Hmm.
Say that again. I didn't quite.
Oh, sorry. Because many people have like their own impressions, right, when coming into
Right. Misconceptions.
Howard's work. I was wondering, is there like a misconception that you guys are just like, ah, I wish people didn't just think of Conan, like,
Well, obviously the depth and breadth of his writing, right? Like the fact is that he wrote more boxing stories than he ever wrote Conan stories, that he wrote, I think he wrote more cowboy stories than he wrote Conan stories. Like the fact that he was his poetry and he was a much funnier writer
Yeah.
than a lot of people think because the Conan stories are so much more stoic. And although it describes them as having great melancholies and great mirth, you don't see too much mirth in the canon stories. But then you read something like Sailor Steve Costigan, and the language that's in that first person narration, or Breckenridge Elkins, is joyous and playful, buoyant in the way that it ricochets around a sentence or the lyrical, the the way it feels and the way it takes you through a character's attitude. And that's the difference. The first person narration in something like Sailor Steve Costigan, he's a fool or he's being duped or he's deluding himself as he's being pulled into these capers or he's getting pulled into fights that he kind of wants to, even though he knows he shouldn't, or he falls for a dame or whatever other kind of ridiculous thing is happening in those stories. And that Howard is a much more jubilant and kind of joyous writer than I think people assume if you just read whatever, Black River or Red Nails or anything like that. And I love those stories. The Conan stories are amazing, but I think one of the things that surprised me was how how fun his writing can be and joyous and engaging on a bunch of different levels. That it's not just about the sword and sorcery of it all, or the grimness and the survival and the destruction and ages upon ages, piled on top of each other. I love those things, and obviously I'm trying to channel a bunch of those things. But probably the biggest misconception is like Robert E. Howard is some, toxic man, macho, freak. And you're just like, no, he's like a playful student of history. He's a joyous poet. He loves deeply and he wants to bring you into these worlds, whatever he's feeling.
That's a misconception that I had when I first started reading Howard too, because all I saw was the fantasy stuff. And I'm I'm hearing about, that he committed suicide, and so the concepts of depression are coming in. And then when you read the Breckenridge Elkins stuff or the humorous stuff, you get a much more broad view of,
Mhm.
well, he had all kinds of gigantic mirths and
Melancholies, yep.
chronic melancholies. And from a psychological standpoint, it gives the lie to this idea that he was this depressed individual throughout his life. Some people have used that. I don't think you can do that, but some people have used that to say, well, he was probably bipolar in nature, that he went from the depressions to the mania. It doesn't, that does not, that diagnosis does not hold up in the fact that he could produce all this material. You just don't, bipolar individuals don't necessarily produce that kind of stuff on demand or when they need it to do it and things like that. So
I think, he also he was his own kind of myth maker, right? So when he talks about that, the infamous idea of Conan, telling him the stories and he's just the bard for the barbarian pounding it out on the typewriter or things like that. And yet in his letters to his contemporaries where he's talking about struggling with a draft or we see multiple iterations of these stories, that they weren't one-time wonders. It can be a lot more potent. In some ways, he's a really good salesman. He's selling the myth of
Yeah.
the inspired author, the lightning shooting through the fingertips and all that kind of stuff. And I've certainly, when I'm writing, if you have an inspired moment and you feel like you're getting that kind of productivity or inspiration that you always wanted, that's what you think being a writer is, or being a storyteller or an artist should be. And in those moments, man, you drink it in. It's a really joyous thing to do. And you want it to feel like that all the time. So the romanticized version of being the author versus the toil and the dram and the frustrations of man, this just isn't coming together. If I was a real creator, if I was a real, author, it wouldn't feel like this. It wouldn't be so frustrating or difficult. The best compliment I've ever gotten about my work on Conan is people say, "Oh, you were born to write this." And I say, "Well, my drafts say otherwise, but thank you so much that the final version
Yeah.
reads that way, that it has the kind of momentum, or it makes you feel the way you felt, when you read the original comics or whatever may have you." But that's, whatever's in front of the curtain. But I don't know. I probably could be a better salesperson about it and tell you that I was possessed with the spirit and riding the lightning every single time, but that's just
Conan
not.
standing over your shoulder with a battle axe,
Yeah,
saying, "Narrate this, Jim."
that's
Right?
right. And it's like that's not the reality of it. I'm just too damn pragmatic. So I
Yeah.
always tell people it's a struggle. The only difference for me now is because I've written whatever, like 80 graphic novels, hundreds of comics, thousands of pages of comics, that when I have that feeling of, oh damn, I can't do this, I don't let it finish me. I don't go, oh, I can't do it, so I won't. What I do is I look at the shelf where my books are and I go, well, you got through it all those other times. So clearly you're able to get through it this time. And you just fight, fight, fight to the finish line.
that whole idea idea of waiting for inspiration is just nonsense. I mean,
Yeah.
you just got to sit down and do it. And
Y-
sometimes you're inspired.
Yeah, you build your own momentum for sure.
Once I get started, I then become inspired a lot of times.
Yeah.
But I don't have an inspiration that goes, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get to the keyboard, sort
Right.
of.
I
The terror of the deadlines. One of the things that's interesting about comic books, because there's multiple people involved in production, right? So the artist can't start drawing the story until I've given them the story, and the colorist and the letterer and all these other components that come together, the collaboration that makes a comic so special. But that I'm that initial burst of momentum, whatever analogy we want to use for it. And the other people in the team, I know them and they're relying on me to generate this material. Every 30 days or sometimes more, we're putting out one of these issues and sending it off to print for a monthly comic book. And if I don't do my job, they don't work and they don't get to eat. Like that, the reality of that is in some ways very much the pulp, kind of mindset
Mhm.
of you've got to, dance monkey, like get this thing done for the deadline and try and be engaged and inspired and excited and all those things, and learning to turn that tap on and go, okay, engage that muscle, that creative muscle, take that inspiration and try and pour it out on the page. And when it does feel special, when it does feel inspired, man, it's the best feeling in the world.
Yeah. I guess going back to the original question, I don't have a whole lot to add to what Charles and Jim say because they hit all of it as far as misconceptions about Howard. because you hit a lot of the big ones. Yeah, a lot of the myths that were created, by people in the 70s and 80s in particular, about Howard, the Milius with the whole story about him. He got that from the camp, who got it from a letter. And in that transmission, it turned from
Yeah. The telephone
Howard being
game on
poetic
glass.
about his inspiration in a letter to Clark Ashton
Yeah.
Smith, to, he's literally possessed. He's obviously crazy. And that's a misconception I'd like to get rid of. It's pretty much gone these days, but you still see it with older fans, that aren't aware of all the new scholarship, the new biographical work that's been done in the last 10, 20, 30 years. I remember we did a big Howard thing at Worldcon in San Antonio, about 10 to 12 years ago. And for those who don't know, Worldcon, that's the World Science Fiction Convention. Those are the old school science fiction fans, right? And they're like, "Oh yes, you're doing how?" Yeah, so I don't need to know anything new about that. I read all of those back in the 60s and 70s when Sprague told me all I needed to know. No,
Right.
no, no, he really did. You know, but I see now we have younger generations. We have like Laura here doing academic work, and fans here that are at Howard Days. We got 20 somethings there that have come to it from the video games, or even millennials that came to it from that Conan the Adventurer cartoon. Right? They
Yep.
missed some of that earlier, more negative myth making that was done about Howard in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Fortunately, it's still sort of out there, and so I sometimes we still feel the
But
need
you
to
can
address it.
definitely put a cleaner line in the sand with those kind of fans. That's what's so great about
Yes.
it. Or, for example, so many people have told me, first of all, it's a joy when an older fan says they were reading the original material or reading the comics in the 70s and they've come back to the new stories that we're doing now because it's got that verve and it's got that feel. But even better, where, I've got newer readers who said, man, they were intimidated by walls and walls of the Conan collections and they didn't know where to start. And we gave them this on ramp that said, okay, 2023, we're doing this Conan relaunch at Titan. And we're not saying the old stories don't matter. What we're saying is actually the original Howard stories are the pillars that we're building this entire
Right.
incredible thing on. And we had the benefit of the 1,000 foot view of all the material, what has worked, what has not worked, what is the pop culture vision of the character. And a bit like Superman, Kryptonite wasn't part of the original story and the Daily Planet wasn't part of the original story. What are the things that are most salient without getting away from the source material? What feels like it's recognizable and has just become a natural part of it? Like the Grecian hero that you see on the covers of Weird Tales is not the Conan that is fixed in people's minds. It's the Frazetta vision of that character. So that's got to be a baseline that we build off of, but keep as much of the Howard as we can.
Right.
Things like that. In one of the issues, I put the Atlantean blade not in the same context as the movie, but because that particular design of a sword is so iconic that it feels associated with the broader mythology. And it's not going to be Conan's sword. He doesn't run around with it through all of his adventures, but that
It's an Easter egg.
it's an Easter egg. It's a
It
joyous
references the
celebration of all
larger
the pieces that have come
thing.
before, while constantly trying to funnel your attention and excitement back to the source material.
A comment on the humor, because that's a great point both of y'all made on, because that is a shock to a lot of people when they first encounter the Breck stories or the Costigan stories. For
Yeah.
me, it was when I first read his letters. You see his humor all through his letters. And it's like the picture you get from Howard when you read his letters is not the picture that you got from those old introductions
Yeah,
in the
not some
Lancers Erases
tortured.
back in the day or Dark Valley Destiny. It's so different when you actually get to read him, writing to his friends, making jokes, lewd jokes, and he's funny. He's funny. And it's not just humorous, it's intelligent, sarcastic, cynical humor, right? It's a
Mhm.
which I love personally. And I'll say this, like you mentioned, like you don't see it as much, in the Conan stories. Once you realize though what his humor style is, that kind of very subtle, sarcastic, um, you know, cynical humor. You do see it here and there in the Conan stories, and you catch it, even though it's
Absolutely.
subtle, right? It's
Absolutely. Well, I feel like
the
God in the Bowl's
magistrate who I had to
yeah,
split it. Of course, I had to split his head in two, right?
yeah.
Or
Oh, at
Zogar
the start of
Sog,
Queen of the Black Coast. Yeah, yeah,
in
right.
Queen of the Black Coast, or Zogar
Yeah.
Sog, the Pictish shaman who's all powerful and like does this great, brings all the tribes together, and he's this horrible antagonist. But he gets like earlier on, he gets captured because he got too drunk one time, like stealing some donkeys, right? Somebody was bringing that up at Howard Days, and I'm like, God, you're right. That's like, you know, there are moments, real moments of humor that are sarcastic, and often commentary, sarcastic, humorous commentary on society and on civilization, right? That is perfectly appropriate, especially for someone writing in the Depression era, right?
Yeah.
That's making fun of the institutions of civilization, making fun of those kinds of things.
It's
And
funny, and
sometimes,
you mentioned that the
yeah,
humorous aspects, my way into writing Sword and Sorcery was a humor comic. And then I found my way. I eventually worked
right,
on official Dungeons and Dragons stuff and Samurai Jack, and now I'm doing Conan. And I really resisted doing any humorous stuff because I thought people would be like, "Oh, the guy who wrote Skull Kickers is going to make Conan a goofball, or gonna."
right.
And now
Well,
that I've been doing it long enough, I feel not that I'm adding goofball elements in, but like, so the newest storyline, Conan's being tracked by this assassin, and the assassin has built up this myth. He's heard these things about this incredibly powerful, dangerous man who's slain and traveled across the country. And, this entire cult was shattered on the edge of his sword because he killed their leader. And then the assassin's like creeping up to his, window in the inn, and he goes, this guy's gonna have bodyguards, he's a warlord, people follow him, he's charismatic. And then he creeps up and he looks over the window and he sees Conan making love to a woman, and there's no guards whatsoever because Conan's just confident and he's just going about his business because that's the kind of barbarian that he is. And a lot of people were like, that moment really threw me off, and I laughed out loud, and I don't normally laugh out loud at a Conan comic. And I was like, and yet
right,
the bravado is kind of at the heart of what makes the character so great as well. That
right.
he doesn't surround himself with all these minions, that he is going to do it himself, or, in some ways leave himself vulnerable because he just doesn't know any better. And that's kind of the beauty of the character as well. Writing a Sailor Steve story was one of the most enjoyable and intimidating things that I've done. I did a horde of research on the vocabulary and the kind of rat-a-tat narration style that he's got in those stories. And I built that thing. And it was so funny because my editor got the script and he goes, man, this does not read like anything else you've done. And I'm like, yeah, but those stories don't. The Costigan
Right.
stories, Sailor Steve should read different and be playful and
Yeah.
over the top. That first person narration is so different and so jubilant. Yeah.
Also, Conan isn't a muscle-bound meathead. Let's throw
He's
that out
just
there
not.
as well.
Yeah, of
Conan is
course, of
not.
course. That I mean,
Yes.
that's the funny.
There's another
In some
misconception we
ways,
should get rid of.
I've hit that weird thing where I have to explain that to people, and it feels like a broken record. And I go, of course, I have to tell you. By the way, he's incredibly, thoughtful. By the time he becomes king of Aquilonia, he knows a half dozen languages, and he's able to fill in the map of the world. And
Right. The
yeah,
opening scene, he has a pen in his hand, not a sword. Stylus in his
got it.
hand, not a sword, right?
And his philosophy about gods and death and existence and all these kinds of things, there is a fatalist attitude to it, but there's also thought put into it. He's not a mindless killing machine. And
No.
if I can add a little bit more of that thoughtfulness and that poetry while still giving people the kind of bombast and the action adventure that
Yeah.
they expect, I might just pull you a little bit deeper than you ever
He's a
imagined.
mindful killing machine.
He's a mindful killing machine. There you go. That's a good way of putting it. Perfect. Yes. Well, yeah, okay. So if you read Conan the Barbarian 25, came out back in October, that was this my first King Conan story, fully painted by Alex Horley. And there's a character in there who essentially is telling King Conan who he thinks he is. And his specific words for the way he describes Conan is essentially my own mouthpiece for the way I think about that character and the kind of the dichotomies that make him so incredibly compelling, right? So in that story, the way he describes him, he says, You are indeed a worthy opponent, Conan. You're a heroic murderer, a philosopher barbarian, a convoluted container for every man's lustful, rage filled pride and poetry. And that's kind of at the heart of what I think Conan is he's this container that we project ourselves onto. And some people see that as a toxic masculinity, and other people see this warrior poet and kind of everything in between, right? And that's kind of we're all finding our own pieces of it, but I feel like Howard's is obviously the true one, and we're hopefully trying to put our stake in the ground as close as possible to the original if we do our job right.
Wow, we have covered much ground. Uh, but in our last 10 minutes, having talked about his legacy, his continuing influence, I wanted to shift the conversation to a little bit more lighthearted ending of what is your hope for like future engagement with Howard's written works, or where do you think we're headed or we're moving towards? Or hopefully, what is your vision of what you hope to see, maybe even?
Sure. I know Jeff and I constantly talk about the fact we would love to see a wider media adaptation that strikes the true chord of the character
Yes.
in Conan, but in other Howard works as well. But because Conan is 20, 30, 50 times more well-known and popular than any other character, he's always going to be the tide that raises all ships. So if we get a damn good Conan adaptation at some future juncture, in whatever medium it takes, if it's
Right.
a beautiful poetic video game, I don't care, animated series or live action or whatever may have you, that will do a lot to pave a new road and to shift the conversation towards the character that we all kind of are so inspired by. And
I,
that is an
I'd love to
ideal.
see an anime version.
Absolute.
You know,
I'd love to
because
see that. Yeah, the kind of
not just because I would enjoy that,
intensity.
but because
Sure.
that will introduce the character to a whole new generation, maybe the way the Marvel
Absolutely.
comics introduced it
Absolutely.
to Rusty's generation, or the movie introduced
Well,
it to
and
my
that's
generation,
that's
right?
the reality of it. You know,
Yes.
when Fred Malmberg talked to me about the new comic series, and he said, "Look, we hope we can get a new movie once a generation, and on the off chance, you know, the ultimate roll of the dice, you get a franchise out of it. That would be amazing. You know, we can do a new novel, hopefully, you know, once a year, or they've got their ebook program that they're putting out short stories. But every 30 days, the comic book reminds people that Conan is vibrant and cool and badass." And we're
I mean,
sort of the sharp tip of the spear. And you can put that comic in front of a movie producer, you can put it in front of a video game fan, you can put it in front of anyone and sort of be like, this character still matters. They're cool. This material is worthy.
Yeah, I mean, I had high hopes for the Solomon Kane movie, for example.
yeah.
And the opening of it bothered me a lot. After that, it really became a pretty good Kane sort of story. But I mean, the problem is, as far as movies go, and this is somewhat true of comics too, is like, as you were saying, Jim, it's in none of these cases is it an individual vision. It's a
Right. It's
collective,
always a
Right.
collaboration.
a collab,
Yeah.
and video games are going to be. And I don't know that we will ever, and I'm okay. I don't know that we will ever get the perfect Robert E.
Sure.
Howard version of these kind of characters. And we were, because there was a question on there too about the canon and thing like that. It's like, what is canon, what is not. I mean, to me, canon is what you decide is canon. What you as an individual reader, what I decide is canon. And if there's something I don't like, I don't have to read it, I don't have to watch it, but I can't gatekeep it. I can't say, well, nobody's allowed to do that with the character. But I can still consume those things personally that I find respectful, or I find that create the image of the character in the way that I want to see it. So I just hope we continue to have that kind of material out there, and that we're going to get a. I really do want a really good movie
Hmm.
that
Like
Really
that would be
tried
so
to stay close
transformative
to
to the
power.
conversation. It would be massive in that way. And exactly what Charles was saying, what I was saying before, because the amount of money it takes to put one of these movies together and the hedging your bets in terms of the marketing and who's the audience for this and how many tickets can we sell and what merchandise will come out of it and all those other things, you're going to so many people, success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. All these people want to hitch their wagon to it if they think it's going to be a big deal and that it's going to be a huge success. And then the minute that if it fails, then they all jump ship and they'll point the finger at whatever, a screenwriter, a director, an actor, whatever, whoever's going to get tarred and feathered for it, for the nature of the thing. And so it's this weird sort of a situation where in order to make the larger the media property, the more people you have to have, that you sort of have to steamroll that unified vision, and who's got the power to see that through to completion. That's
It's tough.
the difficult part of it.
And Jim hits at the point. A lot of fans don't know just how hard it is to pull this off. And behind the scenes,
Tens
I've
of
had
thousands
some,
versus hundreds of thousands of dollars
God,
versus
yeah,
hundreds of millions of dollars.
there've been
Now
several
more and more people
projects
have to, yeah,
have to weigh in. I've been in several projects that I thought for sure, and a couple that were actually Howard
yep,
adaptations. And I'm
yep,
like, oh my
yep.
God, this is so friggin' good. And I'm like, this has got to get made. Streaming series, movies,
Hmm.
and so many different attempts at doing this. And I'm like, God, this is, but it just whatever happened, even though it was perfect, even though it had big names attached, even though on paper this should have been greenlit, it made it a certain way, and then something happened and it didn't, right? Because one thing just wasn't right here. This committee didn't like that. Whatever, the numbers weren't
or
right.
or
Whatever it
or the
was,
problem
right?
is that in order to get one of these off the ground, you get someone who's a decision maker on side, but by
Right.
the time you're now having to sign the deal or get the budget, that person's moved on to another
He's
company.
gone. Right.
And the minute that someone else comes in, they don't want to inherit an older
Yep.
project, because if it is a success, well, that's the feather in the cap of the previous,
Yes.
regime. So we're just going to clean the decks and start over.
And
And
that
and
happens a
I've been on a
lot,
couple,
you know.
yeah, I've been on a couple of these conversations, and we're like, oh, I've my own original stories that I've done. I've been in we've pitched them to Hollywood, and you haven't just the kind of conversations were like, oh, this could be the beginning of the next phase of my life. And then you're just like, oh, 2 weeks later, 2 months later, a year later, it's all gone and it's swept away. And you're just like, wait, what? Like it's unreal when you think about it. That any film seems to get made feels like a
Right.
minor miracle, and yet you can still be. I'm still hypercritical all the time because
Yeah.
I want them to be better. I want
I
them to be as good as they can be.
I force myself not to get my hopes up on any project anymore that I know is in
Sure,
the works. I will say this. There's one that God, dude, we're so close. We're almost there, and
we're
it's
so
coming.
close.
Keep
There's
watching
some
the
cool.
news over the next
There's some
week.
cool stuff in the works. That's the other thing that's really surreal for me. Now that I'm involved
Right.
with this directly and I'm doing consulting and I'm doing some outside the comics, I've got a bigger role to play in terms of narrative and building this stuff. You're in these meetings where you are simultaneously a voice, but you're not a decision maker, and you're trying to guide, it's almost like entertainment aikido, like you're trying to redirect energy to go in the right direction and make sure that this thing can make it, but you don't get to be the one who decides where it lands. And so you just try and be, if you're going to be overly negative or you're going to, tear down things, then nothing's going to get built. But on the other hand, you're trying to be the right kind of critical or redirect that energy. Hey, there's a lot of enthusiasm. Not only is this cool, it would be great if we could elevate or bring these strains of the original, or this is what's absolutely mission critical. All these other things are going to get stripped away. So what if we can keep that core intact? And that's, what it, I don't want to sound too much hubris, but it's part of trying to be a steward of the character in the moment that I've got my hand on the steering wheel as much as I do. So it's strange, but difficult at the same time. Yeah.
I know we're out of time, but I'd like to pitch this same question to Rusty, since we have Rusty here, talking about the
Oh,
future and where, because this is all about the legacy of Robert E. Howard. Rusty, I'd love to get your thoughts. Where do you want to see Howard's legacy go? What would you like to see?
I would like to see more people reading Howard's work and adapting Howard's work.
Yeah.
But, that's not likely to happen in my lifetime. So
I don't know. We've been close a couple times. It just hadn't come to fruition.
I felt like that last Conan movie that Jason Momoa made a great Conan,
He looked great.
and
He did.
the rest of it was just terrible script.
Yep.
And do you know what? The original director on that, Brett Ratner, passed on a script that was an adaptation of A Witch Shall Be Born for the script that we got. Can you believe
Uh,
that?
There
so he
was the
really,
one line that was great when he says, how many names do you have? And he goes, Conan, how many do I need? I thought that was very Howardian. That was a good line.
yeah,
They yeah.
This is the thing. It's such a minefield trying to run these, just as I was developing the 2023 relaunch of the comics, Fred had me on a couple calls with some of these, pretty big names in Hollywood, and we were having a couple conversations, and I thought, oh my God, this is it. This is it, exactly like Jeff. And you need to both be exuberant in that moment and excited, but temper your expectations and not put your heart on too deeply into it. And if you figure out how to do that, feel free to let me know
Yeah.
because I'm
Yeah.
still
It's
figuring
hard
it
not
out
to.
every single time. Yeah.
So close so many times. You know.
Yep. Yep.
I think that what Ben and Tracy are doing is great. I would like to see more young people encouraged to look into Howard and look at it,
Hmm.
and if that means they got to turn it into video games or something, that's great. That's fine. Read the work.
Whatever leads you back to the source material, whatever leads you back to
Right.
that, explosive energy that sent this thing hurtling forward and continues hopefully ever onward.
Yeah, I know that reading is a hard sell these days, but
That's what's so great about them being short stories, though. That's what makes it easier for me to convince people when I tell them they can read most of the Conan canon in like, one sitting per story, and it'll stick with you long after you finish. I think that's one of the things that in some ways is its pulp roots is an advantage in that respect.
yeah, and that
Very,
yeah, it is.
Okay.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to have to wrap up the discussion on this panel. And I'd just like to thank all of you on behalf of the conference for sharing your insights and your experiences with us today. And I'd like everyone attending to also please join me in thanking Charles, Jim, and Jeff for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for being here.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. Glad to have people here.